So, welcome to today's session. This is going to be all about UK native species and biodiversity. And we're delighted to have a very special guest for you today. We're joined by Ruth Brookes, who's a natural Habitats Supervisor here at Kew. The natural area is a really exciting part of the gardens, and we hope you're going to learn lots of tips and tricks to take into your own projects. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ruth, who's going to tell you a little bit more about what they do in the gardens and their role.
Hi, nice to see everyone. So I'm Rue, and I've worked at Kew for the last 4 years, managing the natural area. So Kew's natural area makes up about 10% of the gardens, so it's quite large. And within the area, we really focus on managing it for biodiversity and managing it as a complete ecosystem. So we really think about how all the wildlife and the plants link together to make that ecosystem. So over the course of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about biodiversity, how to boost it. We'll mention native species because they quite often enter the conversation whenever UK biodiversity is spoken about. I'll talk a little bit about the future of native species with climate change, and I'll give you some tips and tricks for sort of new growing projects, some easy wins for how to boost your biodiversity. So I will attempt to share my screen so you can see my presentation. Hopefully that has worked. Yes. Excellent. So UK native species and biodiversity. I wanted to start off just by talking about what exactly the definition of a native species is. So I really love this map. It basically goes right back to Ice Age UK, about 10,000 years ago, and it shows that the UK actually used to be joined by a land bridge to the rest of Europe. There was so much water locked up in the ice caps that the sea level was a lot lower. So during that time, plants were free to make their own way onto the UK. As the ice retreated, you got a lot of plants like birch starting to colonize that land that had recently become free of ice. So during that time, we had a few plants come over, a few animals with them. But towards the end of the Ice Age, enough ice melted that that land bridge actually disappeared and just became the sea. So basically, any plants or animals that had entered the UK under their own steam and not via human intervention are considered natives. And I think it's an interesting one because in continental Europe, there's less of a distinct divide between natives and non-natives. I think because the UK is an island, there is that we can sort of almost put it to a year in the past where we stopped having plants making their own way to the UK. So that is the basic definition. And the reason that native species are considered so beneficial for biodiversity is because plants and animals have had that 10,000 years since the land bridge disappeared, basically stuck on an island together to evolve and to learn how to use each other. So when you see native trees like oak trees, they can support well over 2,000 different species of animal and fungi. That connection is so strong because those animals have had all that time to evolve alongside the oak tree and find ways to use it. But it's not as simple as saying native species are good, non-native species are bad, because there's plenty of non-natives that are actually really beneficial for biodiversity as well. So you should never kind of distinguish to black and white between them because the non-natives can be very useful and are probably going to become more useful with climate change. So what we're finding at Kew is some of our native species, like the beech trees, are actually starting to really struggle in the warmer, drier climates that we're experiencing here. So we're starting to think about those native species that might not be able to survive here any longer. What do we actually replace them with to fill that ecological gap? And the answer is often non-native species that are quite closely related to those natives that we might be losing. So there's quite an interesting dynamic there where non-natives might actually be able to step in and help support UK wildlife. We're also looking at potentially collecting native seed from further south in its range, around sort of Spain and the Caucasus, where hopefully those individuals will be a lot better equipped to deal with the kind of climate we'll experience in the future. So there's definitely hope for native species. And I will be touching on them further along in the presentation. Let me get to my next slide. Uh-oh. There we go. So easy wins for a new growing project. I thought I'd actually start off by talking about deadwood habitat, which is not the first thing people often think of when you're trying to plan something new, you want to get living plants growing. But deadwood is so important for biodiversity. About 40% of all woodland life actually depends on deadwood in some way. So I've put a few images up that just kind of remind me that there's actually many different types of deadwood habitat. So the little bat in the middle there is a little noctule that I found when I was checking some bat boxes. And they actually love what's called standing deadwood. So big tall trees that have died. They really are useful for kind of cavity nesting birds. Bats will get under the bark and they can even hibernate within the tree. You also get the opposite, where creatures actually like deadwood that's either lying on the ground or actually buried within the ground. So we've got the stag beetle larvae on one side and then the adults on the other, and they actually love a big chunk of deadwood that's just buried underground. The larvae will live within that wood, chewing through it for a good up to 7 years. So you need quite a big chunk of wood, because 7 years worth of eating actually will get through a fair amount of wood. And when they hatch out, the parent, the adult beetle that's hatched, will actually lay its eggs in the same bit of wood where it lived its larval stage, if there's enough left. So the bigger the better when it comes to stag beetles. I've also got an image of one of our natural area volunteers called Jeff building a dead hedge. So I absolutely love dead hedges. They make a really useful barrier if you need to sort of fence an area of your growing project off. Maybe you'll want to sort of hide a compost pile. In this case, the hedge Jeff is building, you can't see very well in the picture, but it's actually by the side of an old quarry. So that hedge was put there to basically stop us accidentally driving our mowers off the edge. When all the bramble's up, you can't really see where the quarry is. So you can really use them for practical purposes, but they're really useful for biodiversity as well. So you basically just use all of your woody waste from the site, and it's a great way of avoiding bonfires. So we're actually in a clean air zone within London, so we can't really burn our waste. So rather than burn it or chip it, we just leave it in these little dead hedges. And you basically put a lot of posts in along your fence line, a little double row of posts, weave some longer whippy bits of wood between them, and then you fill the middle with whatever you've got, really. It can be bramble, it can be, we've used bits of hazel here, but any woody waste can go in there. And we've actually found they're really popular with wrens. We get a lot of little wrens nesting in our dead hedges. We also get newts that spend the winter nice and safe beneath a dead hedge. So it's a great way of saving yourself some trouble, disposing of waste that wouldn't really compost easily, as well as boosting biodiversity. And I also thought it would be nice to draw attention to the fact that you can actually alter wood to make it even more wildlife friendly. So this post was actually a bit of temporary fencing that had to go into the natural area. So we actually boosted its value by drilling these holes, and you can see some of the holes have got what looks like mud within them, and that's actually where bees have gone in and made their nests, little solitary bees. And the bees will use that for a season, and then they won't use the same hole again. So the temporary fencing was just in for 1 year, and that worked really well because the bees could do their whole life cycle within it, and then we knew when the bees had all left, we could safely take the fence down. You can also carry out a process called veteranization if you've got any unwanted trees on site. And veteranization is where you basically create deadwood habitat by artificially speeding up the demise of a tree. So you mimic natural processes like storm damage or even animal damage. Squirrels are quite good at ring barking branches where they actually nibble around the whole of the branch circumference and just nibble that bark off. So if you do that yourself, obviously not nibbling it, but scraping it with a saw or a bill hook, that branch will actually die if the bark is removed in a ring. And that, on the surface, seems like it's going to be a bad thing, but it's actually just mimicking natural processes. And you can, if you haven't got any sort of ancient trees that have got those really cool features like cavities and deadwood, you can actually create those features yourself in a much younger tree. So within Kew's natural area, we've actually got too many trees, which is a nice problem to have. But we've got quite an invasive tree called the turkey oak, which has seeded itself everywhere. So rather than just felling and removing the trees that we don't actually want within the area, we're veteranizing them. So we've ring barked and we've used a winch to just mimic storm damage by just dragging a branch out of the tree, which is, created some really good habitat for bats. They'll use those jagged edges and hide away in there. So that's a fun process to do. It's always entertaining to mimic a storm. Long vegetation is another easy win, and it doesn't have to be a traditional meadow. It can be, because meadows are very good for pollinators and for insects generally. But it could be some cow parsley. If you've got a shaded area, cow's parsley is a good plant because it can tolerate shade very nicely. It's also one of the top plants for pollinators. It could be a patch of bramble or nettle. And the long vegetation is really useful because it can actually help fight the effects of climate change. So in drought conditions, the longer vegetation provides shade. We find our long grass at Kew stays green a lot longer than the mown lawns. They'll actually turn yellow quite early on under drought conditions, whereas the longer grass, because that soil is shaded, it actually holds the moisture a lot better. The longer vegetation also slows runoff from rainfall. So when it rains, rather than just having all the water run across the top of the soil, the vegetation actually helps capture it and keep it there long enough for it to actually soak into the soil. It also helps to reduce soil compaction. So if you've got a site which has kind of been heavily used, maybe it's an old playing field, you can really help break up that soil by allowing your plants to grow big. Usually the above ground height of the plant is kind of reflected in the root mass of the plant. So the bigger you let it go above ground, the more roots it's got below ground. And it's those roots that are going to really help break up the soil, and that will allow water to kind of percolate down and increase your soil moisture, which is always a good thing to try and do in a drought. Thinking of for vegetation, you might want to include some planting for pollinators. So I've included here a little list of my favorite plants when it comes to pollinators. These plants can vary depending on where you're based, but most of the ones I put in my list will grow in most conditions and they're quite easy to get the seed for. You might notice some of them are considered weeds. It's quite interesting because the word weed is not an actual scientific definition. It basically just means a plant that's growing where it's not wanted. So there's no species which are innately weeds. It just depends on what the person's perspective is who's looking at the plant. So for me, a dandelion is not a weed because they're so useful for pollinators. You can also, humans can eat a lot of the plants that are useful for pollinators. So you can make nettle tea, you can put dandelions in your salad. So if you've got a growing project where edibility is part of it, it can be nice to actually have some edible weeds in there. With planting for pollinators, in terms of climate change, it's really useful to try and balance your plants so that you've always got something in flower throughout the year. Climate change is shifting all of the timings for when plants are coming into flower, when insects are emerging, and we're actually seeing the previously, the insects would have emerged right on time when the plant was in flower and everything worked brilliantly. Whereas now their schedules are getting uncoordinated. So maybe the insects are hatching out and the flowers aren't open yet, or the flowers have already gone to seed. So it's creating these real difficulties. But a great way to kind of fight that is to have a wide variety of plants that are flowering all year round, basically. Ivy is a really good one. I think ivy is a very underrated plant for pollinators. Ivy flowers towards the end of the autumn when there's not much else going on, and it will flower even into the winter. And you see a lot of late season bees collecting pollen from it. It can be really buzzing in kind of October, even into November. So I'd say ivy is quite an easy win when it comes to plants for pollinators. Quite an easy one to grow. Knapweed as well. Purple flowering plants tend to be really good for butterflies and bees. The little bee on the left is feeding on a knapweed plant. Again, quite an easy one to grow from seed, and once you've got your own population of it, it's very easy to spread just by shaking the dry seed heads around on top of your meadow. And I also thought it's very important not to forget the caterpillars, because caterpillars are actually even more picky than the adults when it comes to feeding. So in a butterfly or a moth life cycle, the caterpillar stage is all about the feeding, and the adult stage is all about finding a mate and reproducing. So some adult moths don't even have mouth parts and they don't feed. So the caterpillar stage is actually the more important one when it comes to feeding. Some will have such a restricted diet that they'll only actually eat one plant, which is quite frustrating as a habitat manager, because you think, oh, if only you ate more than one thing, it'd actually be a lot easier to keep alive. But an example of that is the brimstone butterfly. They will only eat buckthorn. So if you want to sort of help brimstones thrive in your area, it's really important to plant a little bit of buckthorn. They will actually starve rather than eat something different. And part of that is related to the tree's own defense mechanism. So each different species of tree has a very specific sort of cocktail of chemicals which it uses to defend itself from caterpillars. And these specialist caterpillars have got really, really good at processing the cocktail that one tree species produces, but that's at the expense of learning how to process any of the other tree species' defense chemicals. So they're very, very effective feeders when they're on the right species, and it does help them develop a lot quicker than more generalist feeders that can eat a bit of everything. So it has pros and cons. That's something to take into account when you are creating a growing project, is kind of finding out what wildlife are in your area so that you can really plan what to grow based on that. It's also quite important to be aware of it if you're weeding. It's quite tempting if there's plants you want to take out and you see lots of caterpillars on them, just to kind of shake them off onto a different species of plant and carry on weeding out the plant you don't want. But it's worth bearing in mind that that plant you're weeding might be the only plant they actually can eat. So it's always good to put caterpillars onto a plant of the same species that you found them on. And I've got a little list there of some of the most common caterpillar food plants, which are often different to what they will then feed on as adults. Nettle is a nice one that is, again, an easy win because it's quite resilient to climate change. Grasses, again, a lot of people assume caterpillars feed on sort of herbs or trees, but many species will actually feed on grass. So yeah, a long patch of grass can actually be brilliant for pollinators. I've also put water as a quick win. Digging a pond can seem like a really big commitment, especially with, from a sort of sustainability point of view, keeping it full of water. But I thought it's worth mentioning you don't actually have to keep it full of water all year round. You can let it dry out in the summer. A seasonal pond is a pond that's only really got water in it during the wetter seasons. And that can actually be preferred by some wildlife. So newts really enjoy seasonal ponds, partly because fish can't survive in seasonal ponds, and you often get fish eggs brought into ponds on the feet of birds and that kind of thing. So even if you haven't introduced fish yourself, you might end up with a pond full of fish. But if you do let it dry out, it basically stops those predators from competing with animals like newts. As long as there's enough water in there during the spring for the newts to complete their life cycle, then you're all good. So even a really little pond can actually have a surprising wildlife benefit. Um, and you can fill them from water butts or from kind of rainfall runoff if you've got a glass house or a shed. I've seen them filled really effectively that way. On the flip side to a nice wet pond, we have got bare ground in a sunny spot, kind of baked ground here. And that can be useful too, especially for reptiles. So I've got this little slow worm who's having a bask on the sand there. And we've also got bees. You get a lot of mining bees that will actually dig into soil, and loads of other insects, beetles, little flies even, will make their little nests in exposed soil. So often with a new growing project, it's really tempting to want to plant everything up and kind of fill every inch of space. But it can be really useful just to leave a little bit of bare ground as well, preferably in the sun. It tends to work best where you've got nice soil warmed by the sun. Scrapes is also another interesting idea for a bare soil habitat. So this image is when me and my team went to look at some scrapes that had been dug over at Barnes Common, which is quite close to Kew. And it basically involves, I think they did theirs mechanically with a digger, but you can do it with a spade. Just digging down a little way and then scraping backwards just to expose some of the soil. So you get a little bit of a cliff and then a flat area of soil. And this can expose dormant seeds which are waiting to germinate. So at Barnes, they were doing it to see if there were any historic seeds from plants that don't grow there anymore, kind of locked away in the soil. And they were hoping that scraping the topsoil off would actually reveal them. It can be particularly useful if you've had soil which has been heavily enriched. So if you're developing a site that used to be an agricultural field, for example, you can actually just scrape off that over-enriched top layer and it'll get back down to a less fertile soil, which is actually beneficial for wildflowers because they hate competing with some of the coarser grasses, and a soil with lots of nutrients actually favors the grasses. So the grasses will kind of use all that nutrients, get really vigorous and easily outcompete the wildflowers. Whereas if you have soil with less nutrients, those grasses can't compete as effectively. So you end up having a much easier time for the wildflowers. So yeah, the scrape is actually works on many levels because it exposes these seeds, but it also exposes the soil itself. And this allows you to create that vertical kind of cliff face, which is great for those mining and burrowing insects. And it also has that little basking area that reptiles can use. It's also very educational. So if you've got visitor engagement or sort of school groups coming to visit your site, you can really teach them all about soil and soil profiles. So it's very nice just to be able to get that little look at what's actually going on underground at your site. It can be quite educational. We sometimes dig down at Kew and we'll find clay, and those areas tend to hold water a bit better than other areas where you dig down and you just find pure sand. It's like being on a beach. So it can actually be really eye-opening, and it can sort of explain a lot when you realize you've been trying to grow plants in incredibly free-draining sandy soil. You kind of think, oh, that's why they were struggling so much when it got dry. So yeah, a very interesting thing to do. Speaking of soil, fungi and soil are so important but often overlooked because you can't obviously see fungi a lot of the time. So in these images, I've shown fungi, the sort of fruiting bodies, which is the fungus's equivalent of a flower, basically. It's how it reproduces. But for most of the time, these mushrooms would be just existing as little filaments within the soil called mycelium or mycorrhiza, and you just can't really see it. So it often goes overlooked. This slide is very statistics heavy, so apologies for that. but I do find these statistics absolutely mind-blowing. So they're mostly about biomass, and biomass is basically the weight of everything. So if you were to add up the weights of everything in the world, fungi would make up 2.2%, which doesn't actually seem like much. But when you contrast that with the entire animal kingdom, that is only 0.4%. So basically, fungi has 6 times the biomass of all the animals on Earth, including humans. We're only 0.01%. So we have a big impact despite not making up much of the mass of things on Earth. Plants, on the other hand, make up 80%. So that really helps to hammer home how important plant life is for the health of the planet. And bacteria make up 13%. So that's another kind of unseen force at work in the ecosystem. Interestingly, fungi is often seen as a bad thing for plants. When people see little mushrooms and toadstools popping up in the garden, it's often a worry. But over 90% of plants actually benefit from their relationship with a fungus. Only about 1 to 2% of fungi species will actually attack plants and are considered plant pathogens. Most of them have a mutually beneficial relationship. So it's actually really beneficial to your ecological value to actually try and look after that fungus. So a few of the things you can do to help your fungi thrive are to avoid excessive digging. This can be really disruptive to those little filaments that live in the soil. So rather than digging, you can use cardboard to smother weeds, and that really helps the soil remain undisturbed. The way the fungi and the plants work together is usually the filaments of the fungi will actually connect to the plant's roots. So if you dig the soil, you're kind of severing those connections. The plant gets nutrients which it wouldn't normally have access to from the fungus. So the fungi will actually be able to convert nutrients in the soil into phosphates and other chemicals which the plant needs. And the plant does its part in the relationship by providing carbohydrates from photosynthesis. So it basically gives the fungus sugar, which the fungus couldn't get by itself. So it's quite a nice little dynamic that they have. And that's why avoiding strong fertilizers is a good idea, because if you put lots of fertilizer onto your soils, especially if it's high in phosphates, you actually trick the plant into thinking it doesn't need the fungi to help it anymore, which can make it stop giving those sugary treats to the fungus, and the fungus can actually die basically. And then you're locked into this vicious cycle, because if you stop giving those high nutrients to the plant yourself, then it can really weaken without that fungal partner to help it. So then you're sort of locked into giving it more nutrients yourself. Whereas if you just provide sort of a natural fertilizer, maybe something made out of nettles or comfrey, the plant's not tricked into thinking, oh, I've got so much nutrients, I don't need this fungus anymore. And they can stay working together in their beneficial relationship. Mulching the soil can also be a great way to help the fungus, because you're basically helping to lock in moisture and provide nutrients which the fungi can then unlock and give to the plant. I thought I'd just draw attention to some of those kind of unseen heroes of the natural world. And I thought I'd do this by showing some little kind of food chains and starting off each one with an image which visitors to Kew might initially see. And we often get people kind of seeing things like these leaves that have been nibbled, or a dying tree with peeling bark, and they kind of say, oh, is everything okay here? Like, it looks like there's problems with these trees. But it's actually very natural. Obviously, if either one goes to an extreme and you see a tree that's been completely devastated by insects, there's probably something invasive going on there. But for the vast majority of insect damage, it is very easily managed by the tree. So this little leaf here has been nibbled by caterpillars, which have then been eaten by the blue tits. And this is actually a photo that was taken very recently from our nest boxes at Kew. We have got about 40 little nest boxes, and we get to go around and check them every 2 weeks during the nesting season. We actually had 134 blue tits and great tits fledging from the boxes last year. And right in the week before they fledge, when they're getting ready to leave the nest, they can actually eat 100 caterpillars per day per chick. So, yeah, that ends up meaning that those blue tit parents might have been foraging for over 13,000 caterpillars a day just within the natural area, which is pretty crazy. And it really sort of hammers home the importance of those caterpillars for the ecosystem as a whole. The blue tits actually can't feed their babies on anything other than soft bodied insects. So when you see the parents foraging at the bird feeders for bird food, they're actually doing that to feed themselves and keep their energy up for finding caterpillars. So these chicks really do depend on the caterpillars. So when you see that leaf damage, it's actually a good sign that there's enough food around for the caterpillars, and it should kind of be celebrated for the blue tits even. With the dead tree, I've actually done a little bit of a longer food chain. So the dead tree supports fungi. So I've put a little picture of some mushrooms, which actually look like rotting bread rolls, but they are mushrooms. And we've got the slug, which will come and eat the mushrooms. They're very popular with slugs and with little flies. And then those slugs and little worms will be eaten by the badgers. That's another animal we have plenty of at Kew, luckily. So it's interesting to kind of share these stories of where it looks like there's a problem in the ecosystem, but it's actually what's helping to keep that ecosystem going, basically. Just to kind of finish up my quick tips, I thought I'd talk about the importance of surveying and knowledge sharing. So these little moths are part of our regular moth trapping at Kew. So we run a little light trap and we identify the moths that we catch. And that helps us manage the site, partly because once we've identified the moths, we can identify their food plants and make sure we're providing what they need to thrive. Moths are also a really good indicator species. So, in ecology, indicator species basically can help represent trends that are going on within your ecosystem. So, if you have a very diverse population of moths, it usually means your whole ecosystem is diverse more generally. So, because caterpillars need such specific conditions, each species of moth will need a different set of conditions to successfully pupate and emerge as an adult. If you have lots of different species all managing to do that, it usually means you've got lots of different ecological niches within your site and therefore lots of different species able to use the site. So it's really cool to just track the populations of moths over time. And if we suddenly see a big decline in the amount of species we're finding in our traps, then we have got a little bit of a heads up that something is not going well in the ecosystem. Sometimes that's things outside of your control. So if you have a really, really dry summer, for example, and the food plants the moths are eating are not able to survive, that could account for it. But even then, it's kind of giving you a bit of a hint about what you might be able to do to help. So whether that's trying to kind of condition your soil to help it hold moisture, or even watering your weeds, for example, maybe letting your nettles have a little bit of water from the water butt. Um, or it could be something that is directly under human control. So maybe if a neighbor has been spraying pesticides, it might have an impact on the wildlife on your site. And just having those statistics can really help you work out exactly what's been going on within your area. It's really useful to collect your own data, but sometimes there's limitations to that. It can be occasionally quite expensive or time consuming. So there's actually some really nice websites that you can look at where people have already uploaded data. There's citizen science apps like iNaturalist, which anyone can upload to, and you can actually open the map, look at your site, and see what people have found nearby. There's a really interesting website as well called What's Flying Tonight, where you can put in your postcode and it'll tell you which species of moth have been seen nearby. So it's really interesting to just look at what's already out there, and it can give you some really good kind of pointers in terms of what direction you want to take your management of a site. It's also good for thinking about linking up areas of habitat. So if you can see that you've got similar species of wildlife using your site and a neighboring site, it could be really interesting to try and make more of a connection between the two sites. We've done that at Kew by working with a local golf course, a local rugby club, just to try and create more vegetation along a street which kind of connects the two of us. So just improving the habitat between us. It's not always possible because if somebody else is owning the land and they don't want to make any changes, there's nothing much you can do. But you can really sort of work with neighbours as much as you can to try and link up those sites and create green corridors between them. So yeah, those are my quick tips. I thought I'd move on to chatting to you guys if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That was absolutely fascinating. I was learning lots along the way. Thank you. It was great.